The emergence of Christian worship in the first century occurred within a complex intersection of Jewish religious practice and Roman imperial governance. By the early first century, Judea was a Roman province under direct or indirect administration, with Herodian rulers overseeing local governance in conjunction with Roman prefects. Religious life in Judea and Galilee was organized around the temple in Jerusalem, synagogues in urban and rural centers, and a variety of Jewish sects that included Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and followers of itinerant teachers. The social and political structures of Judea were tightly interwoven with religious observance, and the temple maintained both ritual authority and economic influence. Within this context, the earliest followers of Jesus developed a form of communal worship that maintained elements of Jewish liturgical practice while introducing new patterns of assembly and ritual. The primary sources documenting early Christian worship include textual and archaeological records. Textual evidence is found in the Acts of the Apostles, the epistolary corpus of Paul, and writings such as 1 Clement, composed toward the end of the first century. These writings provide direct testimony to ritual practices, organizational structures, and the movement of communities across the Mediterranean world. Roman records, including administrative references to Christians in provinces such as Judea, Asia Minor, and Rome itself, attest to the existence of organized gatherings and their recognition as a distinct group by imperial authorities. Additional documentation comes from Jewish historiography, including Josephus, who provides contextual information regarding Jewish religious life and sectarian dynamics in which early Christian communities emerged. Archaeological evidence supports the textual records, although surviving physical traces are limited to the 1st and 2nd centuries. Excavated domestic spaces in urban centers, including house foundations and multi-room dwellings in Pompeii, Corinth, and Rome, provide models for house-church gatherings. Inscriptions, funerary art, and symbolic artifacts, such as the ichthys, fish symbol, anchor textual descriptions of worship to specific locations and community practices. While permanent structures for Christian worship were not established in the first century, evidence indicates the adaptation of domestic architecture for communal assembly. These spaces were organized to accommodate multiple functions: teaching, prayer, ritual meals, and communal support. Early Christian worship retained structural continuity with Jewish religious practice. Observance of prayer, scriptural reading, and ritual purity were foundational elements. Jews in the first century observed multiple fixed times of prayer per day, and early Christians continued this practice, incorporating readings from the Hebrew Scriptures, particularly the Psalms, as a basis for collective prayer. The synagogue system provided a model for assembly and communal instruction, although Christian gatherings diverged by focusing on the teachings attributed to Jesus, practices of baptism, and the commemoration of meals associated with his final instructions to followers. The composition and circulation of letters from Paul, including the epistles to the Thessalonians, Corinthians, and Galatians, provide detailed records of worship practices, communal responsibilities, and the organizational framework of early churches. These letters include instructions regarding the Eucharist, prayers, and ethical conduct within gatherings, and they indicate the existence of formalized roles such as elders, presbyters, and overseers, episkopoi. Deacons, mentioned in texts such as 1 Timothy and the Acts of the Apostles, managed the distribution of resources, particularly to widows and the poor, reflecting an integration of worship and social care. These epistolary records demonstrate that worship in early Christian communities was structured, repeatable, and regulated by codified instruction rather than informal or sporadic practices. Writings such as 1 Clement, addressed to the church in Corinth around 96 AD, provide evidence of communication and oversight across distant Christian communities. The letter emphasizes adherence to established patterns of worship, respect for leadership roles, and the observance of ritual practices, including prayer and communal meals. This correspondence documents the coordination of communities beyond single urban centers and indicates a broader pattern of standardized practices by the end of the first century. Historical analysis of 1 Clement demonstrates the existence of early episcopal oversight and the consolidation of communal norms, which would later influence second-century Christian organizational structures. Roman authorities, including Pliny the Younger in his letters to Emperor Trajan, c. 112 AD, provide external confirmation of Christian assembly and worship practices. Pliny's correspondence documents the interrogation and punishment of individuals identified as Christians, noting their gatherings for communal meals, singing of hymns, and engagement in ritual observances. While slightly later than the first century, these records corroborate the continuity of practices established in the initial decades of the movement. Tacitus and Suetonius, writing in the early 2nd century, also reference Christians as a distinct group whose gatherings were sufficiently organized to be recognized and, at times, condemned by imperial authorities. These records establish a verifiable framework of worship that existed under Roman scrutiny. The archaeological record from house churches provides further corroboration. Excavations at Dur Europos in Syria, while dated to the mid-3rd century, offer insight into the continuity of worship spaces that likely evolved from 1st-century domestic gatherings. Multi-room houses with central assembly areas, decorated with inscriptions and modest symbolic imagery, reflect the dual function of early Christian homes as both living space and worship environment. Similar layouts in Roman and Judean domestic structures suggest that early Christian gatherings utilized spatial configurations conducive to collective prayer, instruction, and ritual meals. These arrangements allowed communities to meet while maintaining discretion within urban environments subject to Roman oversight. Worship in the 1st century was inherently communal. Prayer, teaching, and ritual observance were inseparable from daily life, household management, and social support. House churches were small, typically numbering tens of members, and gatherings were dependent on personal relationships, kinship ties, and local leadership. Leadership roles were functional and codified. Elders presided over instruction, deacons administered resources, and overseers coordinated gatherings. These roles were documented in letters from Paul and other contemporaneous sources, establishing a historical record of organizational structure. Communities engaged in mutual aid, distributing food and material support, particularly to vulnerable members such as widows and the poor, integrating worship with practical care. The liturgical elements of early Christian worship were modest but consistent. Prayer was recited at set times of the day, following Jewish precedent, often incorporating psalms. Reading of Hebrew scriptures occurred alongside instruction based on Jesus' teachings. Baptism served as the formal initiation into the community, performed with immersion and confession of faith. The Eucharist, or communal meal, commemorated the instructions attributed to Jesus, consisting of bread and wine, and was linked to ethical behavior and communal solidarity. Hymns and spiritual songs reinforced the content of instruction and provided a structured element to collective gatherings. Each of these practices is documented in primary sources, including Paul's letters, Acts, and 1 Clement, establishing a historically verifiable pattern of worship. The integration of worship and social organization is further evidenced by the correspondence and administrative letters exchanged between early communities. Paul's instructions to Thessalonica, Corinth, and Rome include directives regarding the treatment of elders, communal discipline, and participation in ritual meals. These letters demonstrate that worship was regulated by codified instruction, ensuring continuity across communities separated by geography. The textual and archaeological evidence together establish that worship was not ad hoc, but a repeatable and organized practice embedded in household networks, instruction, and shared ethical commitments. The earliest Christian worship emerged immediately following the death of Jesus in Jerusalem around 30 to 33 AD, during the governance of Pontius Pilate as Roman prefect over Judea. The movement developed within a Jewish context, and the first gatherings were located primarily in private homes and informal meeting spaces within the city. Jerusalem at this time was a densely populated urban center, divided into neighborhoods often organized around extended households. The temple stood as the primary locus of Jewish ritual activity, while synagogues provided sites for local instruction, prayer, and assembly. Early followers of Jesus participated in these Jewish religious structures while simultaneously forming a distinct pattern of communal worship. The principal textual sources documenting early Christian gatherings in Jerusalem are the Acts of the Apostles and the letters of Paul. Acts provides direct accounts of worship practices, leadership, and communal organization within the first decade after Jesus' death. Paul's letters, though largely directed to communities outside Jerusalem, offer corroborating evidence regarding ritual practices, communal meals, and baptism. Additional documentation comes from Jewish historians such as Josephus, who provides the social and religious context of first-century Judea. Archaeological evidence from domestic dwellings in the region, including multi-room houses with open gathering spaces, aligns with descriptions of small communal assemblies. Worship in Jerusalem was organized around several consistent practices. Central among these was the daily assembly for prayer. Observance of fixed times of prayer followed Jewish precedent, with gatherings in the morning, afternoon, and evening. Early Christians incorporated readings from Hebrew scriptures, particularly the Psalms, during these prayer sessions. Scriptural reading was complemented by instruction regarding the life, death, and reported resurrection of Jesus. Apostolic leaders, particularly Peter and John, provided authoritative teaching, interpreting the significance of these events in accordance with the emerging Christian movement. These instructions emphasized ethical conduct, ritual observance, and communal cohesion. Baptism constituted a primary ritual for entry into the Christian community. Sources indicate that baptism in this period was performed by immersion in water, typically accompanied by a confession of faith and renunciation of prior transgressions. This rite was conducted in natural or prepared bodies of water, often located near urban centers or in domestic spaces adapted for ritual use. Baptism served as the formal acknowledgement of a member's inclusion in the community and established a standardized point of participation in communal worship. Acts 2 verse 41 records the baptism of approximately 3,000 individuals following instruction by Peter, providing evidence of large-scale initiation and the integration of baptism into worship practice. The communal meal, later formalized as the Eucharist, was a defining feature of early Christian worship in Jerusalem. Sources indicate that these meals, sometimes referred to as the breaking of bread, were conducted in private homes and involved bread and wine. Acts 2 verses 42 to 46 describes the sharing of food and resources, emphasizing both ritual observance and material support for community members. The meals served dual functions: ritual commemoration of Jesus' instructions and practical sustenance for participants, particularly those in need. This pattern of combined ritual and social care is documented consistently across first-century sources and was integral to the structure of worship. Leadership within Jerusalem's early Christian community was primarily apostolic. Peter, John, and other apostles directed teaching, administered baptism, and oversaw communal meals. Leadership roles were functional and codified through instruction in letters and reports in Acts. While apostles held primary authority, other community members, including elders or presbyters, assisted in the organization of gatherings, the administration of resources, and the oversight of instruction. The division of responsibilities ensured continuity and consistency in worship practices, particularly as the community expanded in size and social scope. Early Christian gatherings maintained continuity with Jewish liturgical practices while incorporating distinctive elements. Prayers included the recitation of psalms, often in Hebrew or Aramaic, and were interspersed with instruction and teaching. Scripture reading extended beyond the Psalms to include passages from the Torah and the prophets, providing historical and theological context. These readings were supplemented by expositions concerning Jesus' life, ethical teachings, and the implications of his death and resurrection. Sources indicate that teaching and prayer were conducted collectively, with the apostles or elders directing the flow of the assembly. Archaeological evidence supports textual descriptions of early gatherings. Excavations in Jerusalem and other urban centers in Judea reveal domestic dwellings with central rooms suitable for assembly. These spaces were often large enough to accommodate several dozen individuals, providing room for ritual activity, instruction, and shared meals. Inscriptions and modest decorative motifs associated with Jewish and early Christian symbolism have been identified in domestic contexts, though these are more prevalent in later archaeological layers. The configuration of these homes, including storage areas for water and food preparation, indicates that the houses functioned as multifunctional spaces for both living and ritual observance. The integration of ethical instruction and communal care into worship is consistently documented. Acts records the collection and distribution of resources to support widows, the poor, and travelers. Paul's letters, while directed primarily to diaspora communities, reflect a continuation of these practices, suggesting that Jerusalem set the model for worship that combined ritual observance with practical care. Leadership was accountable for ensuring the equitable distribution of resources and the orderly conduct of assemblies, reinforcing the structural coherence of worship. Worship gatherings were influenced by the socio-political environment. Roman authorities maintained surveillance over urban centers, and Jewish authorities retained religious and civil control within the temple precincts. Early Christians, as a minority group, conducted worship primarily in private homes to maintain safety and minimize conflict with both Jewish and Roman authorities. Meetings in upper rooms or discreet domestic spaces allowed for the uninterrupted performance of prayer, teaching, and ritual meals. While Acts records large gatherings, such as the assembly described in Acts 2, most gatherings were limited in scale and highly dependent on household availability. Baptism, prayer, and communal meals formed the foundational elements of Jerusalem worship. Baptism as initiation, prayers structured around Jewish practice, and meals incorporating bread and wine were documented consistently across sources. Hymns, psalms, and spiritual songs were sung corporately, reinforcing instruction and the identity of the community. The combination of these elements created a coherent framework for worship that could be reproduced in other urban and diaspora contexts, as later letters from Paul indicate. The circulation of letters and instructions within Jerusalem also established patterns for community regulation and instruction. Apostolic letters directed ethical conduct, attendance at gatherings, and participation in ritual meals. 1 Clement, though composed later, reflects the preservation and transmission of these initial patterns from Jerusalem to communities such as Corinth, demonstrating the broader influence of the earliest worship practices. The letters emphasize adherence to established practices, including prayer, teaching, baptism, and communal meals, providing evidence of continuity in ritual and organization. Following the initial establishment of Christian worship in Jerusalem between 30 and 33 AD, the movement spread throughout Judea, Samaria, and the wider Mediterranean diaspora over the subsequent 2 decades. The expansion was facilitated by both Jewish migration networks and the mobility of itinerant teachers and apostles, particularly Paul, whose missionary journeys in the 40s AD established connections among diverse urban centers. The movement maintained the basic structure of worship established in Jerusalem while adapting to local circumstances, including the availability of gathering spaces, social composition of the community, and oversight by local authorities. Textual evidence indicates that house churches remained the primary venue for worship in this period. These gatherings typically occurred in domestic residences capable of accommodating multiple participants. Archaeological studies of urban dwellings in Asia Minor, including Ephesus and Corinth, reveal multi-room houses with central halls that could function as assembly spaces. Such arrangements were consistent with textual descriptions in Acts, which detail the apostolic travels and the organization of local assemblies. House churches facilitated the combination of instruction, prayer, baptism, and communal meals within a controlled and private environment, minimizing exposure to Roman scrutiny while maintaining regularity in ritual practice. The apostolic mission played a central role in the dissemination of worship practices beyond Jerusalem. Paul's letters, including 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, and 1 Corinthians, provide direct documentation of worship practices, organizational norms, and ethical expectations in newly established communities. Acts 9-15 details Paul's travels to cities such as Damascus, Antioch, and Jerusalem, describing the establishment of teaching, baptismal instruction, and leadership structures. The letters indicate that Paul supervised the development of worship practices by appointing elders and deacons to ensure the continuity and coherence of rituals, including prayer, scripture reading, and communal meals. The administrative role of these leaders was documented, reflecting early forms of governance within decentralized Christian communities. Baptism remained a central rite, for initiation. Paul's instructions in the letters emphasize immersion and confession of faith as prerequisites for participation in the community. Baptism was accompanied by teaching regarding ethical conduct and adherence to ritual practice. Acts 16 verse 33 records the baptism of the Philippian jailer and his household, illustrating that entire domestic units were incorporated into the worshiping community. This process demonstrates that the rite functioned as both initiation and integration, providing access to all aspects of communal worship, including prayer, instruction, and the communal meal. The communal meal, or agape feast, continued as a primary ritual, following the pattern established in Jerusalem. 1 Corinthians 11 verses 20 to 34 provides one of the earliest detailed descriptions of the practice, noting the distribution of bread and wine, the participation of all members, and the importance of order within the gathering. These meals function simultaneously as ritual observance and social provision, with attention to the equitable distribution of food among members. The agape meal reinforced ritual continuity across geographically dispersed communities, serving as a tangible connection to the practices established in Jerusalem. Leadership roles in the diaspora communities were documented with increasing specificity. Elders, referred to as presbyters, were responsible for instruction, supervision of ritual activity, and oversight of community ethics. Overseers, or episkopoi, managed coordination across households and addressed administrative concerns, including the management of communal funds and distribution of aid. Deacons facilitated practical needs such as caring for widows, the poor, and travelers. Paul's letters contain multiple references to these roles, emphasizing functional authority and codified responsibilities rather than charismatic or personalistic influence. These leadership structures ensured consistency in worship practices across communities separated by geography. The integration of prayer and scripture reading remained central to worship. Gatherings included fixed prayers, recitation of psalms, and readings from Hebrew scriptures, reflecting continuity with Jewish liturgical practice. Instruction regarding Jesus' life, death, and resurrection accompanied these readings, providing the doctrinal and ethical framework for participation. Acts 15 describes the council in Jerusalem, in which apostles and elders deliberated on the requirements for Gentile converts, including the observance of ritual and ethical directives. This council demonstrates that worship practices were coordinated and standardized where feasible, with attention to doctrinal and ritual consistency across communities. Communities in the diaspora adapted worship to local social conditions. In urban centers such as Antioch, Corinth, and Ephesus, gatherings were shaped by available space, household composition, and the social status of members. Archaeological evidence from domestic dwellings indicates that central halls were used for instruction and ritual meals, while smaller rooms accommodated prayer and preparation for baptism. The presence of water facilities within homes or nearby rivers facilitated immersion, while storage areas provided space for food and wine. These arrangements demonstrate a systematic adaptation of domestic architecture to worship requirements, maintaining the core elements of Jerusalem practice while accommodating urban constraints. Communal ethics were documented as integral to worship. Paul's letters repeatedly stressed the collection of resources for needy members and the proper conduct of assemblies. 1 Corinthians 16 verses 1 to 4 provides instructions for the collection of contributions, emphasizing orderly and equitable management. Acts 6 verses 1 to 6 describes the appointment of 7 men to manage distribution to widows, reflecting a documented integration of worship with social administration. These practices ensured that worship extended beyond ritual into tangible support for the community, reinforcing continuity and functional stability across diverse locales. The diaspora communities also incorporated the practice of hymns and spiritual songs into worship. Ephesians 5 verse 19 and Colossians 3 verse 16 indicate that singing served as a component of instruction and communal cohesion. Hymns likely included psalms adapted for Christian use and other compositions reflecting emerging theological reflection. Singing reinforced the content of teaching and provided a consistent element across geographically separated communities, supporting both ritual practice and shared identity. Instruction and catechesis accompanied all elements of worship. Converts underwent periods of teaching before baptism, learning ethical conduct, ritual expectations, and communal obligations. Paul's letters, Acts, and later documentation from 1 Clement indicate that this instruction was systematic, structured, and codified, ensuring that worship practices were understood and reproducible in new communities. Catechesis also ensured alignment with established ritual and ethical norms, supporting the broader goal of consistency across the diaspora. The spread of Christian worship in the diaspora was influenced by Jewish networks and Roman infrastructure. Jewish migration networks, including synagogues and trade routes, facilitated contact between communities, allowing itinerant teachers and apostles to disseminate ritual and organizational models. Roman roads, ports, and urban centers provided logistical support for travel and communication, while Roman oversight imposed constraints that influenced the discretion of gatherings. Early Christian gatherings adapted to these circumstances by maintaining house-based meetings, structured leadership, and codified ritual practices. By the end of this period, around 50 AD, Christian worship in the diaspora had become a replicable system. House churches, guided by elders and overseers, conducted prayer, scripture reading, baptism, and communal meals with functional consistency. Hymns and spiritual songs were incorporated into assemblies, and catechetical instruction ensured continuity of practice and understanding. Ethical administration, including the distribution of resources, was systematically integrated into worship. Letters from Paul, Acts, and subsequent correspondence provide extensive documentation of these practices, demonstrating that worship had evolved from its origins in Jerusalem into a structured and adaptable form capable of sustaining geographically dispersed communities. The historical record establishes that by 50 AD, the foundations of early Christian worship were firmly documented. Rituals, leadership structures, and ethical obligations were codified and reproducible across diverse communities. Archaeological evidence of domestic assembly spaces, textual evidence from epistles, and corroborating Roman records together provide a verified account of worship in Judea and the diaspora. Worship remained small-scale and communal, centered on prayer, scripture reading, baptism, and communal meals, and integrated with practical care for community members. This framework provided the model for subsequent developments in ritual, organization, and coordination of Christian communities across the Mediterranean world. Between 50 and 70 AD, early Christian worship evolved into more standardized forms, maintaining continuity with practices established in Jerusalem and diaspora communities while responding to social, logistical, and political conditions. This period corresponds with the continued spread of Christianity throughout Judea, Asia Minor, and the Mediterranean, as documented in Acts, the epistolary letters of Paul, and other early writings such as 1 Clement. The period also overlaps with increasing Roman scrutiny of religious gatherings and culminates in the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple in 70 AD, an event that significantly influenced ritual and organizational practices. Textual evidence establishes that house churches continued as the primary venue for worship. Domestic dwellings with central halls and multi-room arrangements were adapted for prayer, instruction, baptism, and communal meals. Archaeological research in cities such as Corinth, Ephesus, and Rome indicates that these spaces were multifunctional, with a primary assembly room complemented by adjacent rooms for preparation and resource storage. Domestic water sources and nearby natural bodies of water were utilized for baptism, while storage areas allowed for the preparation of bread and wine for ritual meals. The adaptation of domestic architecture for worship demonstrates both continuity with prior practice and a systematic approach to creating functional worship spaces within urban constraints. Leadership roles within communities became increasingly codified during this period. Elders, presbyters, maintained responsibility for instruction and ritual oversight, while overseers, episkopoi, coordinated gatherings and maintained communication among households. Deacons were assigned administrative duties, particularly in the distribution of resources to widows, the poor, and travelers. Acts 6 verses 1 to 6, though occurring slightly earlier, is often referenced in correspondence from Paul and other epistolary sources as a model for administrative roles. The letters of Paul, including 1 Corinthians, Philippians, and Galatians, provide documentation of functional leadership within assemblies, emphasizing order, accountability, and consistency in practice rather than charismatic authority. These structures ensured uniformity in ritual practice and allowed dispersed communities to maintain coherent worship patterns. Baptism remained a central rite of initiation. Historical records indicate that water immersion accompanied by a confession of faith was the normative form. Paul's letters contain repeated references to baptism as the point of entry into the Christian community, establishing participation in prayer, instruction, and communal meals. Acts 16 verse 33 recounts household baptisms in Philippi, demonstrating the inclusion of entire domestic units. Baptism was integrated into broader patterns of ritual, functioning both as initiation and as an affirmation of adherence to communal norms, including ethical conduct and observance of ritual meals. The communal meal, or Eucharist, became more formally structured during this period. 1 Corinthians 11 verses 20 to 34 provides one of the earliest detailed accounts, describing the distribution of bread and wine, the participation of all members, and the regulation of conduct within the gathering. The meal served as both a ritual observance commemorating instructions attributed to Jesus and as a practical mechanism for social cohesion and resource distribution. The integration of the Eucharist with the agape meal illustrates the dual function of worship, liturgical and social. Letters from Paul emphasize orderly participation, including the equitable provision for all members and the avoidance of disorder, reflecting codification of practice across geographically dispersed communities. Prayer practices were standardized around fixed times of day, incorporating readings from Hebrew scriptures. Psalms were central to these gatherings, recited corporately and accompanied by instruction. Acts 2 verse 42 and 1 Corinthians 14 verses 26 to 33 document collective prayer and the use of psalms and spiritual songs as part of instruction and communal reinforcement. Hymns and other forms of song were employed consistently across communities, reinforcing teachings and creating a shared ritual experience. The integration of prayer, scripture reading, and musical elements reflects continuity with Jewish liturgical structures while providing a distinctive pattern for Christian worship. Scriptural readings expanded to include letters from Paul and other apostolic writings alongside the Hebrew Scriptures. These readings were integral to instruction, providing ethical guidance and clarification of ritual practices. Early communities relied on memorized and recited texts, as physical copies were limited. The circulation of letters allowed for coordination between communities, ensuring that instruction in worship practices, ritual observances, and ethical conduct remained consistent across diverse locations. 1 Clement, written around 96 AD, provides retrospective evidence of the consolidation of these practices, emphasizing adherence to established norms of prayer, baptism, Eucharist, and leadership oversight. The destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD by Roman forces during the First Jewish-Roman War had significant implications for worship in Judea. While early Christian worship had largely operated independently of temple rituals, the loss of the central Jewish sacrificial site reinforced the adaptation of domestic spaces and house-based gatherings. Communities increasingly relied on private homes and rented halls to maintain prayer, instruction, baptism, and communal meals. The destruction of the temple also eliminated a point of pilgrimage and ritual convergence, accelerating the standardization of practices within local communities and emphasizing the portable and reproducible nature of Christian worship. Ethical instruction and the integration of social care were central to the organization of worship. Letters from Paul and accounts in Acts document the collection of resources for distribution to needy members. Acts 6 verses 1 to 6 describes the appointment of 7 individuals to manage distribution to widows, demonstrating codified administrative roles that were replicated in diaspora communities. 1 Corinthians 16 verses 1 to 4 guides the orderly collection of contributions, indicating the systematic integration of resource management into ritual practice. Ethical conduct, communal support, and order in gatherings were inseparable from worship, reinforcing both cohesion and continuity across geographically dispersed communities. The development of formalized roles in ritual practice became increasingly evident. Elders oversaw the conduct of prayer, scripture reading, baptism, and the Eucharist. Overseers coordinated the logistics of gatherings, including scheduling, space management, and communication with other households. Deacons ensured equitable distribution of resources, including food, clothing, and financial support. Acts, Pauline letters, and 1 Clement consistently document these roles, providing historical evidence for early administrative and ritual structures. The codification of leadership was functional, emphasizing operational continuity rather than doctrinal hierarchy or charismatic authority. Hymns and spiritual songs were integral to worship in this period, serving both as ritual reinforcement and as instructional tools. Colossians 3 verse 16 and Ephesians 5 verse 19 document their corporate use, while Acts provides indirect evidence of psalm singing in assembly. These musical elements were integrated with prayer and scripture reading, creating a structured and recognizable sequence within gatherings. Hymns were likely derived from Jewish liturgical traditions, adapted to the ethical and ritual teachings of the emerging Christian movement. Instruction before baptism became increasingly formalized. Catechesis included teaching on ritual obligations, ethical conduct, communal responsibilities, and the meaning of worship practices. Epistolary sources demonstrate that instruction was structured, often extending over a period before initiation. Catechetical instruction ensured that converts were adequately prepared for participation in all aspects of worship, including prayer, communal meals, and leadership recognition. This practice reinforced consistency across dispersed communities, contributing to the replication of worship structures beyond their original urban context. The coordination of communities across geographic regions relied on the circulation of letters, personal envoys, and reports. Paul's letters to Thessalonica, Corinth, and Galatia provide direct evidence of instruction, oversight, and correction regarding ritual practice. Acts describes apostolic visits to multiple urban centers, confirming that instruction in worship, leadership appointment, and resource distribution were actively monitored. 1 Clement later documents adherence to these established patterns, demonstrating continuity in instruction and the institutionalization of ritual norms by the end of the first century. By the conclusion of this period, Christian worship had evolved into a coherent, reproducible system integrating prayer, scripture reading, baptism, communal meals, hymns, and leadership structures. The combination of domestic assembly spaces, codified leadership, systematic instruction, and integration of ethical and social responsibilities provided a functional framework that could be replicated across diverse geographic and cultural contexts. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates that practices were both consistent and adaptable, ensuring continuity despite local conditions and external pressures, including Roman oversight and the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. The period from 70 to 90 AD was defined by significant external pressures on early Christian communities, particularly following the destruction of the Jerusalem temple by Roman forces in 70 AD. The loss of the temple had both practical and symbolic implications for Jewish religious life, and early Christian communities, while distinct, operated within a Jewish framework and experienced its consequences directly. The destruction disrupted pilgrimage, ritual observance, and centralized religious authority, necessitating adaptation in the practice of worship. During this period, early Christian gatherings continued to rely on domestic spaces, upper rooms, and occasionally rented halls, maintaining structured worship practices while exercising discretion to avoid confrontation with Roman authorities. Textual sources documenting this period include the Acts of the Apostles, Paul's letters, and 1 Clement. Acts describes the expansion of communities into regions such as Asia Minor, Greece, and Rome, with house churches as primary venues. Paul's letters, including those to the Corinthians and Romans, provide detailed accounts of ritual practice, ethical instruction, and leadership responsibilities, indicating continued standardization of worship elements despite external pressures. 1 Clement, addressed to the church in Corinth around 96 AD, reflects the persistence of leadership structures, communal ethics, and worship practices originally established in Jerusalem and the diaspora. These sources, together with archaeological evidence, establish a reliable framework for the study of worship practices during this period. House churches remained the central location for gatherings. Archaeological studies of domestic spaces in Rome, Corinth, and Ephesus reveal multi-room residences adapted for assembly, with central halls sufficient to accommodate dozens of members. Upper rooms, attested in textual sources such as Acts 1 verse 13, provided discrete locations for meetings suitable for prayer, instruction, baptism, and communal meals. These domestic spaces served both ritual and practical functions, enabling communities to maintain continuity of practice under Roman oversight. The dual purpose of these spaces reflected both religious and administrative needs, integrating ritual observance with social support. Baptism continued as the formal rite of initiation. Sources from Acts and Paul's letters indicate that immersion was standard, accompanied by a confession of faith and the renunciation of prior transgressions. Acts 8 verses 36 to 38 describes the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch, demonstrating that baptism was performed in accessible locations and adapted to varying circumstances. Immersion rituals were conducted in natural bodies of water or domestic facilities, providing both practical and symbolic consistency with previous practice. Baptism during this period retained its function as the entry point into the community and as the prerequisite for participation in communal prayer, instruction, and the Eucharist. The Eucharist and communal meals were documented as central elements of worship. 1 Corinthians 11 verses 20 to 34 provides instructions on the proper conduct of these meals, emphasizing order, equitable participation, and ethical integrity. Acts 2 verses 42 to 46 reports the continued sharing of food and resources, illustrating the integration of ritual and social support. The agape meal served multiple functions. It was a ritual commemoration of Jesus' instructions, an instrument for community cohesion, and a mechanism for the distribution of resources to those in need. These meals reinforced both ritual practice and communal responsibility across geographically dispersed communities. Prayer and scripture reading maintained structured forms. Daily prayer continued at prescribed times, incorporating Hebrew scriptures, particularly Psalms, alongside emerging Christian hymns and spiritual songs. Corporate singing, attested in Ephesians 5 verse 19 and Colossians 3 verse 16, was integrated with instruction and communal worship. Scripture reading expanded to include apostolic letters alongside traditional Jewish texts, establishing a framework for doctrinal and ethical instruction. The circulation of letters facilitated coordination between communities, ensuring consistent observance of ritual practice despite dispersion and Roman scrutiny. Leadership roles were increasingly codified. Elders supervised ritual activity, including prayer, baptism, and communal meals. Overseers coordinated logistics, communication, and adherence to instructional norms, while deacons administered resources and addressed the material needs of vulnerable community members, such as widows and the poor. Acts 6 verses 1 to 6 documents the appointment of deacons to manage resource distribution, establishing a model replicated throughout the diaspora. Pauline letters reiterate these functional responsibilities, providing evidence that leadership roles were formalized, operational, and integral to the continuity of worship practices. Roman oversight imposed constraints on public assembly. Christians were a minority within urban centers, and their gatherings were sometimes subject to scrutiny, as noted indirectly in later sources, such as Pliny the Younger S. letters to Emperor Trajan, c. 112 AD, and Tacitus' account of Nero's actions against Christians. While slightly later, these sources confirm that Christians were recognized as a distinct group whose assemblies were sufficiently organized to be monitored. The need for discretion influenced the use of domestic spaces and reinforced house-based worship as the primary model. These constraints encouraged adaptability while maintaining core practices, including prayer, baptism, communal meals, and scripture reading. Ethical instruction was integral to worship, reflecting both communal stability and ritual coherence. Acts and Paul's letters provide repeated documentation of the collection and distribution of resources to support widows, the poor, and traveling members. 1 Corinthians 16 verses 1 to 4 details procedures for contributions, emphasizing order and equity. Acts 6 verses 1 to 6 records the appointment of 7 individuals to manage these responsibilities, illustrating that ethical administration was embedded within ritual practice. The integration of ethical instruction with worship ensured that ritual observance was inseparable from practical care, reinforcing continuity across dispersed communities. The composition and circulation of letters provided mechanisms for standardization. Paul's correspondence to Corinth, Rome, and other communities directed the conduct of prayer, instruction, baptism, and communal meals, while addressing deviations from established norms. 1 Clement, written later in the century, reflects adherence to these norms and emphasizes the preservation of leadership authority, ritual order, and ethical responsibility. The combination of local instruction and correspondence facilitated the reproduction of worship practices across geographically separated communities. Hymns and spiritual songs served as standardized components of worship. Ephesians 5 verse 19 and Colossians 3 verse 16 document their use, while Acts indirectly confirms psalm singing in gatherings. These elements provided continuity and cohesion, reinforcing instruction and creating a recognizable ritual sequence across dispersed communities. Hymns were likely derived from Jewish liturgical material, adapted for Christian ritual and ethical instruction, and performed corporately to consolidate communal identity. The destruction of the Jerusalem temple reinforced the necessity of independent worship structures. With the temple no longer operational, early Christian communities in Judea, and to some extent in diaspora communities, relied entirely on private homes, rented halls, and upper rooms for assembly. This reliance necessitated the codification of practices to ensure reproducibility and continuity. Rituals such as prayer, baptism, Eucharist, scripture reading, and hymn singing were standardized to provide a portable, adaptable framework that could be maintained in any domestic setting. Archaeological evidence from this period, though limited, supports textual documentation. Excavations of house churches in Rome, Corinth, and Ephesus demonstrate the adaptation of domestic spaces to ritual needs. Central halls accommodated instruction, prayer, and communal meals, while adjacent rooms supported resource storage and preparation for baptism and feasts. Water facilities within homes or proximity to rivers facilitated immersion, while storage spaces allowed for equitable distribution of resources during agape meals. Material culture and architectural adaptation confirm the functional integration of ritual, social care, and domestic life. By 90 AD, early Christian worship under Roman pressure had evolved into a structured, reproducible system capable of maintaining consistency across diverse locations. House churches provided reliable venues, codified leadership roles ensured order, and core rituals, prayer, baptism, Eucharist, scripture reading, and hymn singing, were maintained systematically. Ethical instruction and resource distribution were integral to ritual, ensuring cohesion and continuity under external constraints. Circulation of letters and oversight by leaders facilitated standardization, while archaeological evidence corroborates the adaptation of domestic spaces for worship purposes. By the final decade of the first century, early Christian worship had developed into a more standardized and coordinated system across communities in Judea, Asia Minor, Greece, and Rome. The period between 90 and 100 AD is documented primarily through 1 Clement, the letters of Paul, fragments of Ignatius of Antioch, and references in Roman administrative records. Archaeological evidence, including domestic assembly spaces and early inscriptions, corroborates textual accounts, providing a material basis for understanding the structure, rituals, and communication mechanisms of early Christian worship. The combination of textual and archaeological evidence demonstrates that Christian communities had achieved a degree of uniformity in ritual practices, leadership organization, and communal administration, enabling the movement to maintain cohesion across geographically dispersed communities. House churches continued as the primary locus of worship. Archaeological evidence from urban centers such as Rome, Corinth, and Ephesus reveals multi-room domestic structures with central halls capable of accommodating gatherings for prayer, instruction, and ritual meals. Upper rooms were commonly employed for privacy and security, a practice established in Jerusalem and sustained in diaspora communities. Domestic arrangements facilitated the performance of all core worship elements, including baptism, communal meals, prayer, scripture reading, and hymn singing. The adaptation of domestic spaces remained functional rather than symbolic, designed to meet the practical requirements of worship under both Jewish and Roman oversight. Baptism retained its position as the initiation rite for new members. Historical documentation indicates immersion in water, accompanied by confession of faith and renunciation of sins, as the normative practice. Acts 8 verses 36 to 38 provides one example of household baptism, demonstrating that entire domestic units could be incorporated into the community. Paul's letters, particularly Romans and 1 Corinthians, underscore baptism as the prerequisite for full participation in worship, including the Eucharist, corporate prayer, and instruction. The practice of catechesis preceding baptism became increasingly formalized, ensuring that initiates comprehended ethical obligations, ritual requirements, and communal expectations. Catechesis included instruction on prayer schedules, participation in communal meals, and conduct during gatherings. This structured approach ensured the reproducibility of worship practices across dispersed communities. The communal meal, or Eucharist, had become standardized in form and function by the end of the first century. 1 Corinthians 11 verses 20 to 34 details the procedural elements, the distribution of bread and wine, orderly participation, and attention to equitable sharing of resources among members. Acts 2 verses 42 to 46 documents the continuation of resource sharing during meals, emphasizing communal responsibility. These meals served multiple purposes: liturgical commemoration of Jesus' instructions, reinforcement of communal identity, and practical support for vulnerable members. Agape meals were integrated with ritual observance and social administration, ensuring that ethical responsibility and liturgical practice were inseparable components of worship. Prayer practices were codified and structured. Gatherings included fixed times of prayer, often following Jewish precedents of morning, afternoon, and evening observances. Psalms and other Hebrew scriptures were recited corporately, complemented by instruction drawn from apostolic letters. Hymns and spiritual songs, documented in Ephesians 5 verse 19 and Colossians 3 verse 16, were incorporated systematically into worship, reinforcing instruction and communal identity. The integration of prayer, scripture reading, and hymnody created a uniform pattern of worship, enabling dispersed communities to maintain coherence and consistency despite geographical separation. Scriptural reading expanded to include both Hebrew scriptures and apostolic letters. Pauline correspondence circulated widely and guided ethical conduct, ritual practice, and communal administration. Letters from Paul to Corinth, Rome, Galatia, and Thessalonica documented procedures for baptism, Eucharist, prayer, and hymn singing. 1 Clement demonstrates the reliance of communities on preserved apostolic instruction, emphasizing adherence to established norms and the authority of elders and overseers. This widespread circulation of letters facilitated communication between communities and enabled the coordination of worship practices across the Mediterranean. Leadership roles were further codified. Elders, or presbyters, were responsible for conducting prayer, supervising instruction, and overseeing baptism and communal meals. Overseers, or episkopoi, coordinated domestic assemblies, communication between households, and adherence to ritual and ethical norms. Deacons handled the distribution of resources, ensuring equitable support for widows, the poor, and traveling members. Acts 6 verses 1 to 6 and Pauline letters document these roles, establishing them as functional offices rather than symbolic or charismatic positions. Ignatius of Antioch, writing at the very end of the 1st century, emphasizes the importance of unity under overseers, further confirming the institutionalization of leadership and its centrality to standardized worship. The integration of ethical administration into worship practices was well established. Communities collected contributions and managed the equitable distribution of resources. 1 Corinthians 16 verses 1 to 4 outlines procedures for orderly collection, while Acts 6 verses 1 to 6 describes the appointment of specific individuals to manage distributions. Ethical conduct and social responsibility were inseparable from worship. Leaders were accountable for maintaining order, ensuring fairness, and providing for the needs of the community. This integration reinforced cohesion, preserved continuity, and provided a consistent framework for dispersed assemblies. Communication between communities relied on letters, emissaries, and local envoys. Pauline letters contain instructions for correcting deviations in worship practice, supervising baptism, and guiding ethical behavior. 1 Clement to the Church in Corinth illustrates the exercise of coordinated oversight, reflecting adherence to established leadership structures and ritual norms. These communications ensured that dispersed communities followed consistent procedures for prayer, scripture reading, hymn singing, baptism, and communal meals. Coordination also facilitated dispute resolution, as seen in 1 Clement, which addresses conflicts regarding leadership and adherence to ritual norms. Hymns and spiritual songs functioned as instructional and ritual tools, reinforcing doctrinal instruction and communal cohesion. They were performed corporately and included adaptations of psalms and early Christian compositions. Singing was integrated with instruction, prayer, and communal meals, creating a predictable and reproducible pattern of worship. The standardization of musical elements reinforced uniformity across communities, providing continuity in both liturgical content and rhythm of assembly. Archaeological evidence supports textual accounts. Excavations of house churches in Rome, Corinth, and Ephesus demonstrate the continued adaptation of domestic spaces to accommodate prayer, instruction, baptism, and communal meals. Central halls provided assembly space, while smaller rooms supported preparation for baptism and food storage. Upper rooms and discrete domestic locations enabled private gatherings, consistent with Roman oversight and social realities of minority religious communities. Material culture confirms the functional integration of ritual, instruction, and social administration. By the end of the first century, Christian worship was a reproducible and standardized system. House churches provided reliable venues. Leadership structures, including elders, overseers, and deacons, ensured order, and core rituals, prayer, scripture reading, baptism, Eucharist, and hymn singing, were codified and consistent. Ethical instruction and resource distribution were fully integrated into ritual practice. Catechetical instruction before baptism ensured that initiates understood communal and ritual expectations, preserving continuity across dispersed communities. Letters and communication mechanisms facilitated the coordination of worship and reinforced adherence to established norms. The historical documentation demonstrates that by 100 AD, early Christian worship had moved from localized house gatherings into a network of structured communities with standardized rituals, codified leadership, and consistent ethical and liturgical practice. These communities maintained coherence despite geographical dispersion and external pressures, including Roman oversight. Archaeological evidence of domestic assembly spaces corroborates textual accounts, confirming the functional integration of ritual, leadership, instruction, and social care. The standardization of worship practices established during this period laid the foundation for subsequent developments in early Christian liturgy, governance, and intercommunity coordination. By the final decades of the first century, the practices of baptism, the Eucharist, prayer, and hymn singing were well established across early Christian communities. These elements were consistently documented in textual sources, including the letters of Paul, Acts of the Apostles, 1 Clement, and fragments of Ignatius of Antioch. Archaeological evidence from domestic assembly spaces, inscriptions, and communal artifacts corroborates textual accounts, providing a material basis for understanding the structure, administration, and continuity of ritual practices. These practices were central to community cohesion, reproducibility, and identity across dispersed Christian assemblies. Baptism remained the primary rite of initiation and formal incorporation into the community. Water immersion was the normative form, accompanied by confession of faith and renunciation of sins. Acts 2 verse 41 and 8:36. 38 document household baptisms, demonstrating the inclusion of entire domestic units, including adults, children, and servants. Pauline letters such as Romans 6 verses 3 to 5 and 1 Corinthians 12 verse 13 present baptism as a central theological and ritual marker, symbolically representing entry into the community and participation in the death and resurrection of Jesus. The practice was standardized to include preparatory instruction, often referred to as catechesis, which ensured that initiates understood both ethical obligations and ritual expectations before baptism. Catechetical instruction covered prayer practices, participation in communal meals, and understanding of scripture readings and hymns. Water for baptism was obtained from domestic cisterns, wells, or nearby rivers. Archaeological studies of house churches in Corinth, Ephesus, and Rome indicate the adaptation of spaces to accommodate immersion. Rooms or courtyards with water containers were arranged to allow full or partial immersion, with practical consideration for hygiene and accessibility. Baptism was conducted in the presence of leaders, typically elders, and sometimes overseers, ensuring adherence to ritual norms. Textual evidence emphasizes that baptism functioned as both a religious and social rite, integrating new members fully into the community. The Eucharist, or communal meal, developed into a standardized practice with both liturgical and social dimensions. 1 Corinthians 11 verses 20 to 34 provides the earliest systematic description, outlining the distribution of bread and wine, the sequence of actions, and the requirement for order among participants. Acts 2 verses 42 to 46 documents the continuation of shared meals alongside the collection and distribution of resources, illustrating the integration of ritual and communal care. Archaeological evidence from domestic halls, including table arrangements and storage vessels, supports textual accounts of communal meals, indicating that these spaces were equipped to facilitate ritual practice alongside practical support for members. The Eucharist involved the consecration of bread and wine, distributed to participants under the supervision of elders or presbyters. Participation was contingent upon baptism, ensuring that members had undergone instruction and were recognized as full members. Meals were conducted in a manner that preserved order, prevented exclusion, and ensured equitable distribution, reflecting both ritual and ethical concerns. Agape meals were linked to charitable acts, such as support for widows, the poor, and traveling members, integrating social responsibility with ritual observance. The structure and procedure of the Eucharist were remarkably consistent across dispersed communities, as evidenced by Pauline correspondence and 1 Clement. Prayer was central to daily worship and structured according to established schedules. Early Christian communities maintained Jewish precedents of morning, afternoon, and evening prayers, while adapting forms to include instruction, communal concerns, and intercession for absent members. Psalms and other Hebrew scriptures formed the core of corporate recitation, while apostolic letters provided doctrinal and ethical instruction to accompany prayer. Ephesians 6 verse 18 and Colossians 4 verse 2 emphasize continual prayer, indicating that structured prayer was both communal and individual. Prayers were conducted publicly in gatherings, led by elders or appointed individuals, and often incorporated responses from the assembly, providing continuity and structure across communities. Singing of hymns and spiritual songs was integrated systematically into prayer and instruction. Ephesians 5 verse 19 and Colossians 3 verse 16 explicitly document the corporate use of hymns, indicating performance within the assembly context. Hymns were derived primarily from psalms and early Christian compositions, and their repetition in worship provided both doctrinal reinforcement and communal cohesion. Hymnody was coordinated with prayer and scripture reading, ensuring that worship followed a reproducible sequence. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions referencing singing, corroborates textual sources, confirming that musical elements were an established part of ritual by the end of the 1st century. The integration of these practices, baptism, Eucharist, prayer, and hymns, provided a framework for uniform worship across geographically dispersed communities. Leadership oversight was critical to maintaining consistency. Elders conducted and supervised baptism, coordinated Eucharist, led prayer, and organized hymn singing. Overseers ensured logistical support, including scheduling assemblies, maintaining communication between households, and overseeing resources. Deacons administered material needs, ensuring equitable participation in communal meals and supporting ethical and ritual continuity. Textual evidence from Acts 6 verses 1 to 6 and Pauline letters demonstrates the functional codification of these roles, emphasizing operational authority rather than charismatic or symbolic status. Ethical conduct was inseparable from ritual observance. 1 Corinthians 16 verses 1 to 4 and Acts 2 verses 44 to 45 illustrate the collection and distribution of resources to support members in need. This ethical integration ensured that worship extended beyond liturgical action into tangible communal care. Social administration, including the maintenance of resource equity and support for vulnerable members, was formalized and overseen by deacons and elders. By incorporating these practices into ritual, early Christian communities maintained cohesion, reinforced the function of leadership, and provided continuity across dispersed communities. The preparation and conduct of rituals were guided by written texts, primarily apostolic letters. Pauline correspondence emphasized proper observance, ethical behavior, and procedural order in baptism and the Eucharist. 1 Clement confirms adherence to established norms, detailing the responsibilities of elders and deacons in supervising ritual and administrative practice. These texts, circulated among multiple communities, facilitated standardized worship and established mechanisms for correction, oversight, and replication of practice. The combination of textual instruction and local leadership ensured uniformity without dependence on centralized infrastructure. Archaeological and material evidence corroborates textual documentation of ritual practice. House churches, including domestic halls and upper rooms, provided discrete and functional spaces for assembly. Water facilities supported baptism, while table arrangements facilitated communal meals. Storage containers preserved provisions for agape meals and the distribution of resources. Inscriptions referencing leadership roles, hymns, and assembly practices further confirm the integration of textual norms with material culture. These sources collectively document the practical, replicable, and standardized nature of worship. By the end of the 1st century, these 4 practices, baptism, Eucharist, prayer, and hymn singing, were fully integrated into early Christian worship. They provided a coherent framework for ritual, doctrinal instruction, and communal ethics, ensuring continuity across dispersed communities. Leadership structures, catechetical instruction, and communication via letters and emissaries reinforced consistency, enabling communities to maintain recognizable practices despite geographical separation. Textual evidence from Acts, Pauline letters, and 1 Clement, combined with archaeological confirmation, demonstrates that these practices were documented, codified, and widely implemented. By the end of the 1st century, early Christian worship was inseparable from the social organization of communities. Documentation from Acts, Pauline letters, 1 Clement, and fragments of Ignatius of Antioch demonstrates that ritual, ethical conduct, and resource management were integrated into a unified communal framework. Archaeological evidence from domestic assembly spaces, inscriptions, and material culture provides additional confirmation of the social and structural organization of early Christian groups. Community life encompassed practical administration, care for members, and adherence to structured worship practices, forming the operational and ritual basis of first-century Christianity. Early Christian communities relied primarily on domestic spaces for assembly. House churches in Rome, Corinth, Ephesus, and other urban centers demonstrate that domestic architecture was adapted to meet both ritual and social needs. Central halls provided space for prayer, scripture reading, baptism, and communal meals. Adjacent rooms or courtyards facilitated preparation for ritual meals, storage of provisions, and immersion baptism. Upper rooms and private chambers provided discretion in areas subject to Roman oversight or Jewish scrutiny. Archaeological analysis confirms that these adaptations were functional, reflecting operational requirements rather than symbolic representation. These spaces allowed communities to maintain continuity of worship while fulfilling social responsibilities. Community gatherings were structured around leadership roles, which were both functional and codified. Elders, or presbyters, conducted worship, supervised instruction, and maintained order during prayer, hymn singing, baptism, and communal meals. Overseers, or episkopoi, coordinated logistics, facilitated communication between households, and monitored adherence to ritual and ethical norms. Deacons administered resources, ensuring equitable distribution to widows, the poor, and traveling members. Acts 6 verses 1 to 6 documents the initial establishment of deacons for resource distribution, demonstrating the integration of ethical administration into communal life. Pauline letters further document these roles, confirming their replication across dispersed communities. Leadership was operational, not symbolic. The offices existed to ensure continuity, coordination, and functional governance. Distribution of resources was a central component of community life. Acts 2 verses 44 and 45 and 4:32-35 describe the pooling of material possessions and equitable allocation to meet the needs of members. Collections were organized during worship gatherings and supervised by deacons, as detailed in 1 Corinthians 16 verses 1 to 4. This systematic approach to resource management ensured that vulnerable members, including widows, orphans, and travelers, received consistent support. Agape meals, which combined ritual and social functions, were directly linked to these practices. The integration of ritual and resource administration demonstrates the practical cohesion of early Christian communities. Ethical conduct was inseparable from worship. Instructions in Pauline letters emphasized honesty, fairness, and accountability within both ritual and social contexts. Romans 12 verses 13 to 21 and 1 Corinthians 6 verses 1 to 11 detail behavioral expectations for members, including the equitable treatment of fellow believers. Leadership was responsible for monitoring adherence to these ethical norms, enforcing accountability, and resolving disputes, as evidenced in 1 Clement's address to the Corinthian church. Ethical administration was therefore embedded within both ritual observance and social organization, maintaining internal consistency and functional continuity. Household structure influenced both ritual and social dynamics. Leaders were often heads of domestic units, providing logistical support for gatherings and ensuring access to space, water for baptism, and provisions for communal meals. Household arrangements enabled the inclusion of extended family members, servants, and clients, creating a replicable social structure for gatherings. Acts 16 verses 15 and 1 Corinthians 1:16 and Acts 10 verses 24 to 48 document household-based gatherings, highlighting the practical integration of domestic space into ritual practice. Archaeological studies of Roman and Greek domestic architecture corroborate textual evidence, confirming the use of multi-room layouts to support both ritual and administrative functions. Participation in community life was comprehensive but stratified by functional responsibility. Both men and women participated in prayer, scripture reading, and hymn singing. While leadership roles, particularly elders and overseers, were predominantly male, women served in supporting roles, including the distribution of resources and hosting gatherings in domestic spaces. Acts 16 verses 14 to 15 references female household leaders hosting assemblies, demonstrating functional inclusion without establishing formal leadership positions. These arrangements reflect operational requirements rather than doctrinal prescription, ensuring the practical reproduction of worship and social support. The integration of worship and social administration was reinforced through ritual. Baptism marked entry into both the liturgical and social structure of the community. Initiates were instructed in ethical conduct, participation in communal meals, prayer schedules, and hymn singing. The Eucharist and agape meals combined liturgical commemoration with the equitable distribution of resources, reinforcing both communal identity and practical responsibility. Textual evidence demonstrates that these practices were codified and replicated across multiple communities, ensuring continuity and standardization. Prayer and hymn singing were coordinated within communal gatherings. Psalms and other Hebrew scriptures were recited collectively, while Christian hymns, as documented in Colossians 3 verse 16 and Ephesians 5 verse 19, were performed to reinforce doctrinal instruction and communal cohesion. Leadership directed the sequence of prayer and song, ensuring consistency in performance and participation. Archaeological inscriptions referencing hymnody and psalm recitation corroborate textual accounts, confirming the integration of musical elements into both worship and community identity. Communication and coordination between communities maintained operational consistency. Letters circulated by Paul, as well as correspondence referenced in 1 Clement, guided ritual practice, ethical expectations, leadership oversight, and conflict resolution. Communities exchanged letters and envoys to ensure adherence to established norms, including procedures for baptism, Eucharist, prayer, hymn singing, and resource distribution. Coordination was functional rather than symbolic, enabling dispersed communities to replicate worship and social organization with fidelity to documented precedent. The destruction of the Jerusalem Temple in 70 AD reinforced the independence and reproducibility of domestic worship spaces. Communities relied on domestic and rented assembly locations, enabling standardized practices that could be maintained without centralized infrastructure. Ritual observances, including prayer, baptism, Eucharist, and hymn singing, were portable and adaptable to multiple domestic contexts. Social administration, including resource collection and distribution, was integrated into these assemblies, demonstrating a fully functional system of community cohesion under variable local conditions. By the end of the 1st century, early Christian communities demonstrated a replicable model of worship and social organization. House churches provided secure venues for liturgical and administrative activities. Leadership roles ensured functional oversight of ritual and social responsibilities. Core practices, including baptism, Eucharist, prayer, and hymn singing, were standardized across communities. Ethical administration and the equitable distribution of resources were integrated into ritual practice. Communication between communities, through letters and envoys, maintained coordination and consistency, ensuring that dispersed communities adhered to established norms. Archaeological evidence corroborates textual sources, confirming the adaptation of domestic architecture to meet both liturgical and social needs. By 100 AD, early Christian worship had evolved from localized, home-based gatherings into a network of structured communities with standardized rituals, codified leadership, and integrated social administration. Historical documentation from the Acts of the Apostles, Pauline letters, 1 Clement, and fragments of Ignatius of Antioch demonstrates continuity in ritual practice, ethical instruction, and leadership organization across geographically dispersed communities. Archaeological evidence, including domestic assembly spaces, water facilities for baptism, storage for communal meals, and inscriptions referencing leadership and hymnody, corroborates textual accounts. The historical record establishes that early Christian worship during the first century was a coherent, replicable system that provided the foundation for subsequent Christian ritual, governance, and identity. Worship had become codified around four principal practices: baptism, the Eucharist, prayer, and hymn singing. Baptism functioned as the formal initiation rite, performed in water by immersion, accompanied by confession of faith and renunciation of sins, and preceded by catechetical instruction. Texts including Acts 2 verse 41, Acts 8 verses 36 to 38, and Pauline letters such as Romans 6 verses 3 to 5 confirm that baptism was universally recognized as the entry point into the community and a prerequisite for participation in other ritual practices. Archaeological studies of domestic house churches in Rome, Corinth, and Ephesus reveal that domestic and courtyard spaces were adapted to accommodate immersion, demonstrating the practical integration of ritual into residential architecture. By the end of the first century, baptism had achieved functional uniformity and reproducibility, ensuring continuity across diverse communities. The Eucharist, or communal meal, had similarly become standardized. Acts 2 verses 42 to 46, Acts 20 verse 7, and 1 Corinthians 11 verses 20 to 34 document the procedural and ethical elements of these meals. Bread and wine were distributed to participants under the supervision of elders, following order and ensuring equitable participation. Agape meals combined ritual observance with social responsibility, integrating resource distribution and communal care into the liturgical framework. The consistent documentation of procedures for the Eucharist and agape meals across multiple communities indicates the codification of both ritual and social administration. Archaeological evidence, including table arrangements and storage vessels in house churches, confirms the adaptation of domestic spaces to accommodate both ceremonial and practical functions. Prayer and hymnody maintained structure and uniformity. Corporate prayer incorporated psalms and Hebrew scriptures, while Christian hymns, documented in Colossians 3 verse 16 and Ephesians 5 verse 19, reinforced instruction and communal cohesion. Leaders directed the sequence of prayer and hymn singing, providing consistency in practice across households. Hymnody functioned as both a liturgical and instructional tool, reinforcing theological and ethical instruction while consolidating communal identity. Inscriptions referencing hymn singing in domestic spaces corroborate textual sources, confirming the integration of musical practice into structured worship by 100 AD. Leadership structures had become operationally codified. Elders supervised prayer, baptism, the Eucharist, and hymnody. Overseers coordinated communication and logistics. Deacons administered resources, including collection and equitable distribution for widows, orphans, and traveling members. Acts 6 verses 1 to 6, 1 Corinthians 16 verses 1 to 4, and 1 Clement document these roles and their replication across dispersed communities. Ignatius of Antioch, writing at the end of the 1st century, emphasizes the centrality of overseers in maintaining continuity and order, confirming the functional codification of leadership. These offices were essential for reproducibility, ensuring that ritual and social administration remained standardized across geographically separated communities. Social and ethical administration was inseparable from worship. Acts 2 verses 44 and 45 and 432, 35 detail the pooling of resources and equitable distribution to maintain communal stability. Ethical instruction, as documented in Romans 12 verses 13 and 21 and 1 Corinthians 6 verses 1 to 11, emphasized fairness, accountability, and adherence to community norms. Leadership monitored compliance with ethical standards, mediated disputes, and ensured orderly participation in ritual practice. This integration of social administration with worship reinforced consistency across dispersed communities and established operational procedures for the management of resources, participation, and ritual adherence. Household-based gatherings served as both ritual and administrative centers. Domestic architecture in urban centers, adapted for assembly, facilitated continuity and reproducibility of practice. Multi-room layouts enabled centralized prayer, instruction, baptism, and communal meals, while auxiliary rooms supported preparation, storage, and immersion. Upper rooms provided discretion under Roman oversight, consistent with the minority status of early Christians. Acts 16 verse 15 and Acts 10 verses 24 to 48 document household gatherings, confirming textual evidence of domestic assembly as a replicable, functional model. Archaeological findings in Rome, Corinth, and Ephesus further demonstrate the adaptation of residential spaces to meet the practical requirements of worship and social organization. The circulation of letters and instructions ensured coordination across communities. Pauline correspondence, including letters to Corinth, Rome, Galatia, and Thessalonica, guided ritual, ethical conduct, and leadership responsibilities. 1 Clement illustrates the enforcement of standardized practices, addressing disputes, and confirming adherence to established norms. Communication via letters and local envoys maintained consistency, enabling dispersed communities to replicate ritual and administrative practices effectively. This system of correspondence represents an early network of oversight and coordination, essential for standardization in the absence of centralized ecclesiastical infrastructure. The historical record establishes that by 100 AD, early Christian worship was a fully reproducible system integrating ritual, ethical instruction, leadership, and social administration. Baptism, Eucharist, prayer, and hymn singing were universally recognized and codified practices. Leadership roles ensured operational continuity, and catechetical instruction guaranteed understanding of both ritual and social expectations. Ethical administration, including equitable resource distribution, was embedded into worship, creating a unified framework for community life. Letters and communication networks provided mechanisms for coordination, dispute resolution, and replication of practice across geographically dispersed communities. Archaeological evidence supports these conclusions. House churches were adapted for practical assembly, including spaces for immersion baptism, storage for communal meals, and central halls for prayer and hymnody. Inscriptions attest to leadership roles, hymn singing, and assembly organization, confirming textual accounts. The convergence of textual and material evidence demonstrates the reproducibility and functionality of early Christian worship, illustrating its effectiveness in maintaining coherence and continuity across dispersed communities. The period from 30 to 100 AD shows a progression from small, intimate gatherings in Jerusalem to a standardized network of worship practices integrated with social administration. Early Christian communities relied on domestic spaces for assembly, coordinated through functional leadership, and maintained consistent ritual practices, including baptism, Eucharist, prayer, and hymn singing. Social and ethical administration was inseparable from ritual, ensuring cohesion and continuity. The circulation of apostolic letters and local correspondence enabled coordination and replication, confirming adherence to established norms. Archaeological evidence confirms the adaptation of residential architecture to meet the functional needs of worship and social care. By 100 AD, these practices had established a historical framework for Christian ritual and communal organization. The continuity, standardization, and reproducibility of worship ensured the survival and expansion of Christian communities despite dispersion, minority status, and external pressures. Baptism, Eucharist, prayer, and hymn singing provided consistent ritual markers. Leadership structures ensured functional oversight, and social administration integrated ethical practice with community life. Letters and inscriptions demonstrate the mechanisms of coordination and standardization across multiple regions. The combination of ritual, leadership, ethical administration, and communication created a replicable system capable of sustaining community cohesion and identity over time. In conclusion, the legacy of first-century Christian worship lies in its documented structure, reproducibility, and integration of ritual, leadership, and social administration. Historical evidence demonstrates that by 100 AD, Christian communities had achieved standardized practices across dispersed locations, codified leadership roles, integrated ethical and social responsibilities into worship, and maintained coordination through correspondence and local oversight. These developments provided the foundation for the subsequent evolution of Christian liturgy, ecclesiastical governance, and community identity in the 2nd century and beyond. The historically documented elements of early Christian worship, as preserved in textual and archaeological records, form the basis for understanding the development, resilience, and spread of Christianity during its formative period.